Okay, welcome back to our 12th episode of the Pediatric Practice Podcast of Awesomeness and MediaCast. I'm here with Brandon. Brandon, say hello.
I would, but I got this feeling in my face of all the punches you just gave me with our discussion right now. I mean, you totally beat me up, and I thought that was some low blows, my friend, low blows. I don't know, where all this came from.
I was fighting blindfolded with one hand tied behind my back. You didn't even get both barrels.
And I still got beat up. I mean, I can't believe that. I mean, I wasn't even to put a dent. I see your face is good, no black eyes, no nothing.
Still pretty. I'm still pretty.
So for those of you that don't know what the heck we're talking about, is that Chip and I are recording this shortly after we've had this intense debate on the SOAPM, actually on the PPMA, or the Practice Managers listserv. So if you're on that, you know what we're talking about. If you're not on that, you should, because it's a great resource. And Chip and I just got finished with an intense debate about RVUs. Anyways, that's why I was referencing getting beat up, because Chip, I tried my best to defend myself. We'll see what the judges say. We'll have to leave it up to the judges.
Well, and I think it's actually going to be the subject of our next podcast, frankly, because even if you want to ignore it or fight it, or actually, in fact, even if you don't like RVUs, the best way to arm yourself against them is to at least understand.
Yeah, you're right.
What they're trying to do, and so.
Well, the reason why I hate them so much is because I think that I've gone down the path to understand them. I don't think I'd be that passionate if I didn't know anything about it.
I will actually tell a story at our next podcast that I haven't told many people, but is very. It actually bumps into conspiracy theory stuff, and I'll see if I can tell it in a way that won't identify the suspects. So it'll be good. That'll be our cliffhanger. So why are we here today, Brandon? What are we discussing? We have a very particular topic.
Yeah, so we on SOAPM the other day, there was an interesting question that came through from Dr. Skinner, Katrina Skinner, and what I understand from her email is that she just started out her practice about 4 years ago out of residency, and she had some very interesting question about growing the practice, particularly with how, when do you know when it's right or it's the right time to add a physician to the practice, and then how to structure compensation for that physician and things like that. And when I read that email, I wanted to respond to it, but it was going to take me too long because I had too much to say. So I decided that it would be good, and I asked Chip, why don't we talk about this on the podcast? Because reading that is a lot of the same questions that she had were the exact same questions that we had when we first started, and in fact, to this day, we have many of those same questions. So I wanted to address some of those, give you my experience, kind of my thoughts, and then, of course, I'd like to hear what you have to say, Chip, because I'm sure that you have lots of great stories and different things to look at when it comes to this topic.
All right, well, great. So we have her email, and she was kind enough to let us quote her, and I think her questions are great. And I know, because I've worked with Brandon, over the years, and I know that he's got some stories that relate to this. But I also have a couple interesting anecdotes or some stories of my own from my clients that I think our hope, as is always the case with a podcast, that we can share some information or evidence or an anecdote that will keep you from either making the same mistake that someone else did or make it easier for you to do the right thing. The first thing that she asked about, which honestly, if Brandon and I could solve this question, answer this question for practices everywhere, we would be doing the podcast from our own private islands. And she asks this, all right? She said, I recently interviewed a potential MD candidate. She looks fine on paper and was nice enough in the interview. But how do you know if someone is going to be right for your practice? My practice is small, so bringing in a bad apple would cause a huge problem. Plus, she's the only person I've interviewed. All right, Brandon, what lessons have you learned about your recruiting process and how you find out how to match employees or physicians?
Okay, so we originally, our strategy was to find a warm body, and that was sufficient, to fulfill our needs. And that was, of course, a huge mistake. The first time it worked out okay, and the second time we did that, it was a catastrophe. The candidate that we had, I just don't want to go too much into details, but it did not work out. It just did not work out. So what we had to do before we even begun the process of hiring again is that we had a heart-to-heart. Me and Joanna, as most people know, she's a pediatrician of the practice. I manage the practice, and we're partners in this, more life partners and business partners in this thing. So what we did is we sat down and we first tried to determine exactly who we were, essentially, right? What our vision was, what we wanted from our practice. We already had 6 or 7 years in practice, I think 6 years at that point when that happened with us. And I said, if we had to do it all over again, how will we do it with the benefit of having 6 years under our belt? And one of the things that we determined is deciding exactly what we wanted from our practice and what the goal was. So did we want to become huge? Did we want to grow the practice like crazy? Did we want to remain small? We had to determine these sort of things. And once we had a pretty good idea, with the help of with some consultants actually, we created a company charter, and this charter basically outlines our mission. And this charter helped in many ways, many ways. But one of the ways that it helped us is that we were able to find a candidate we were looking for a candidate that fit our vision for the practice. And for example, when we started interviewing, we would ask questions specific to that would address specific issues that we had in our company charter, which essentially outline all of our values. So that was one big step that I think that we took that has helped tremendously in when we interviewed, because automatically right from the get-go, after talking a few times with a candidate, we know whether if that person fits our or not that we know 100%, but we have a pretty good idea that we can at least move forward with this person. We can't make the determination that this person is going to work out, but at least it lays out the groundwork, the blueprint, and to decide whether or not this person is worth pursuing, because we know whether or not they fit within our culture. And we were very open about this document that we have called our company charter, and we explain what our vision is, and essentially that person has to subscribe to our vision, has to understand it, has to learn how to embrace it, and that's one aspect of one of the things that we do. And I have a few other things, but I want to turn it over to you to jump in here. I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Brandon, first of all, the fact that you have a charter, which is a variation very similar to having a mission, and have consciously reviewed your goals for the practice, I think is the first and best advice that I would give to anybody. How can you possibly know who is a good match for your practice if you don't even know who your practice is? I often tell people that choosing the people you work with is as important as choosing your spouse, because you're going to spend more time with them, frankly, on a day-to-day basis, and they can make you as miserable or as happy as a good choice at home. And so, although there is some luck involved, I would say that if you apply some of the lessons that marriage counselors have learned over the years, you're also going to be more likely to succeed. For example, one thing that I like to tell people or remind people all the time is it takes work. Just like in a marriage, okay, just because you found someone today that looks good or answers your questions well doesn't mean that person is going to be the same in 6 months or that you're going to be the same in 6 months. So you need to not only be conscious about what it is you're trying to accomplish, but you want to be ready to evolve as you add more people to your practice. Now, the other piece is when I think about the expectations of that occur during the hiring process, the first question I ask people is, are you looking for a partner or are you looking for an employee? And that's a question that a lot of people don't answer well. I know a lot of people who are clearly looking for employees because they still want to be in charge of everything, but they want to hire a partner in order to distribute some of the risk and management of the company. And you can't always do that. I also know people who want to hire partners but are going out and looking for employees. The opposite occurs.
Yeah.
So really, one of the things, and to be clear, you obviously may not know. You may be interested long term in a partner, but in the short run, you're looking for an employee because you want to confirm that the matchmaking might work. That's absolutely valid. But sometimes you are just looking for an employee. If you have no aspirations for a partner and you want employees, that can set up the entire framework of your hiring process. Now, let me add just one other point before I punt it back to you. One of the questions that Dr. Skinner asked, it was earlier in her message, I skipped right by it, was, should I be looking for a nurse practitioner or for a physician? Although this may differ on a regional basis, one of the pieces of advice I give practices to all the time is, who cares? If you need someone in your practice to help you with your volume, a bad physician is a bad choice every time. A bad nurse practitioner is a bad choice every time. You should not choose one over the other simply because of their title and their training. If you can find a good nurse practitioner, you will want to latch on to that person and get them in your practice, because a good nurse practitioner in most environments will earn real money for you.
Yeah.
If you're lucky and you can find a pediatrician who's willing to work full time for you or with you, either one, you're going to latch on to that person. So I usually tell people, don't get sold on one type of provider or the other. Did anything I say misalign with what you've seen in your practice so
Yeah,
far?
I agree with you with the NP, but I get the feeling that there's a lot of people that would not agree with you in terms of it wouldn't matter whether you have an NP or an MD. I agree with you though.
Oh no,
I've heard the argument.
I think it matters. I think there is a difference between them. But if you
No, no,
go,
but I understand what you're saying. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. That you're looking for the best of the best, regardless. And if it is an MD, great. And if it's an MP, that is worth looking at too. I think is what you're saying.
right, and I just don't settle on a bad physician or a physician that you are afraid won't match. I'd rather have a practice hire nobody than hire a bad physician, because that's a disaster, and you know what that pain is like.
Yeah, the one thing that I would add about the nurse practitioners, and at least this is strictly talking about my experience, and we have an awesome nurse practitioner. I mean, we would trust our own kids with her. She's very competent in everything, and I don't think that she would mind me saying this, but they're because this is how they're trained, and what their purpose in a practice is, to support. And what that means, if you're not a physician that has that kind of a heart to supervise, to watch over, to mentor, then the NP may not be the best choice for you, even though you might have the best NP. Even the best NP needs kind of this supervision. And I know some doctors that simply don't want to deal with it. It's like, well, it's just like having a resident under me. I just want them to go and not have to think about anything that they're doing. So that's more of a personality thing, I understand. But that would be the only thing that you have to make an assessment of whether or not you feel comfortable providing that oversight that most likely, no matter how good that MP is, it still will require. So that's a thing that I would consider.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. The
Yeah.
other piece that I think just extends where you started is, when you are going to hire this new provider, I think it makes sense to write down your expectations and be as blunt and upfront about your expectations as possible. And by that I mean, here's how many patients I expect you to see. Here are the types of patients I expect you to see. Here's the type of call I expect you to cover. Here's how much I expect to pay you. Here's how much you can earn if you go above and beyond. Here are your responsibilities after in addition to seeing patients. Too many of the practices I know don't even go over that stuff after they've hired the doctor.
Yeah.
It just sort of gets figured out, and I'm a big fan of spitting it out and saying it up front. Say, hey, look, this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking to pay someone $200,000. I'm expecting them to see 20 to 30 patients a day. they're going to split call, and you're going to do every other weekend. And after a couple years, if this looks like it's working well, I would love it if you became a partner. What's wrong with saying that? And a lot of people
Well,
are.
I'll tell you what. Again, I agree with you, but from somebody that's been on this side, one of the things that I often feared when we were in the beginning, especially when you're in a desperate need for somebody, and this for me it was for everybody it's painful, but I can especially for the doctor that has spent Doctor Joanna and I, she went almost 3 years on call, and Dr. Skinner. She's been in practice 4 years. My guess is that she's been taking calls for 4 years and working by herself. So
Right.
what happens, here's what happens is that you are so desperate for a candidate that you purposely try not to mention anything that could be interpreted as negative, because then that is you feel that person is going to be discouraged. The second thing,
Is that a good thing or bad thing?
I know, it's a bad thing, but here's the thing, you have to just know that you're dealing with this, and you're desperate because you've been working 4 years every day. The other thing is that as a small practice, you have very little bargaining power, in terms of salary, in terms of things like that, and you have people that you're going up against, a hospital, for example, or you're going up against a huge practice. And so it's like being firm. It's like, well, here's what you're going to get paid, and we'll maybe consider you as a partner if you do well. It's just like, who do these guys think they are? I'm going to have to be on call every other week as opposed to every 4 or 5 weeks, with another large group. I'm not saying it's right. It's like that was our fear when I was in front of a doctor, and I was just trying to make this deal as sweet as could be.
But Brandon, that's how we end up doing a podcast, and you talking about the time you hired a bad doctor.
I know. Let me jump in a little bit about how we've refined our process, because I talked about the company charter, and we also developed, in addition to the company charter, we developed a path to partnership. And we had to think about what it was that we were looking for in a candidate if that candidate was asking for a partnership. So first we had to answer the questions, do we want a partner? And I would say 9 out of 10 times at this very moment right now, maybe 8 out of 10 times, we will most likely say no to a partner. But here's our thought process. In order for us to get the type of candidate that we thought that we need, the level of candidate, we felt that it was necessary to offer the partnership, because that was an incentive for the type of person that we were looking for. Right?
Brandon, that's a really good point, because in a way, your charter supports that. You are looking for the type of physician who is actually going to be engaged with your practice.
Right.
Who's actually who wants to grow and wants to contribute. So, the fact that that's what you're shooting for, and you stated it consciously, that's a great start. A lot of people don't even get that far, which is sad. But
it took us 7 years to get there, so it wasn't like right off the bat. So, we wrote down essentially what would a candidate look like. And quite frankly, we didn't make a distinction whether we wanted a partner. I guess we did, but in a way we didn't. We just said, here's what we're looking for. We want this person to have these qualities. We want this person to go the extra mile, and this is what we mean by going the extra mile. We want this person to pursue excellence. This is our definition of excellence. We want a person to continue, striving for education, becoming better, not only personally but professionally. This is what our definition of becoming more educated is. So we were it was painful, to tell you the truth, it was painful, because you have these things in your mind, but having to put it on paper is one thing, and then having to explain it to somebody is something. So that process really helped us become crystal clear about our practice, and that's why.
I have a question for you, though, actually. Now, this is interesting. I hadn't thought of this till now. Did you find that you and your wife had different expectations that you had not been aware of until you started writing this stuff down?
I don't think we did. The thing is that we never, we had it both in our minds, and because we we work well together and we complement each other very well. Obviously, and we know what our strengths and our weaknesses are. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've been successful as a team moving forward. Is that we were both in alignment. So in essence, we are good partners, not just and I know that just because you're a happy married couple doesn't necessarily mean you're a good business partner. In our case, it works in both situations, and that's just maybe I don't know. Maybe there's a seminar somewhere in there.
You're very lucky. You're very lucky.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that that's what you need, but my thing is as partners, even without leaving the marriage aside, as partners, we were on the same page. We both are in alignment with our objectives, with our definition of excellence, of what we think the practice should look like. And that, of course, helped us.
Yeah, I've bumped into practices over the years who, when working on any of these issues, when we go through the process of the practice definition, two long-term partners will wake up and look each other in the eye and say, "Oh, I thought we've been on different pages for the last 2 decades. No wonder it's been a challenge all this time." So
Right.
I realized that you not too long ago gone through the process, so I wanted to hear about that. Anyway, so back to you. So you've gone through your process, you've put this stuff on paper, you've defined what your ideal candidate would look like. Then what?
So we have that, and then this thing we just started doing, and I've referenced it already several times, I think in the podcast, and then actually I just talked about it when I was speaking last week. We have adopted this character assessment profile questionnaires, and there's a whole bunch of them out there. There's the Myers-Briggs. We use one that's called the DISC, D-I-S-C, and you can look those up, and there's many companies that distribute that. And these are essentially questionnaires that help you identify what are the personality traits and character traits, strengths and weaknesses of the people. Now, one of the people that you're looking for, and we did this for our practice, and I did it, the doctors did it, and the employee did it. There was no discrimination when it came to that. There is different levels, like you can create one for managers, one for employees, and in fact, I just bought one for my daughter who's 14 that gives her kind of what her interest is, so to kind of know what her strengths are, so it helps her kind of define her role as she decides what she wants to do. So it's valuable in multiple levels. But before you give that to anybody, my suggestion is that it's important for your staff in your office and even your partners to do it. And obviously, if you have a large practice, that's a little bit different. You can decide whether or not the whole office should do it or just the partners. But with Dr. Skinner, I think it would be with her staff and her. And I think she said she had a PA or an NP working with her part-time or something like that, or I don't know if I'm mixing stories. But anyways, and what this does is that it helps you further identify the strengths of your practice, right? It helps you identify what you're good at and what you're not good at. So the question now becomes, who do I want to come into the practice? Do you want somebody that will bolster, like uplift your character strengths? Do you want somebody to balance you? Or do you want somebody that's going to challenge you to move up to the next step? Or do you want somebody that's just exactly like you so you don't have any issues? And of course, there's pros and cons to that. But I would suggest for Dr. Skinner in these tests, they're only I want to say 30, maybe $40, even if it's $100. And the candidate doesn't work out, that's nothing. Even if it costs $250 to find out that this candidate is not worthwhile, goodness, man, that is one of the best investments I can think of.
I couldn't agree more. I think you're absolutely right. And then one of the things that I tell people, I mean, and you know this, Brandon, the hardest job that everyone who runs a pediatric practice has, by far, now, I don't think anything's as important, is finding and hiring good people. And really, Dr. Skinner's message, that was like the point of it. How do I find and hire good people? And once they're in front of you, which is what we've been talking about so far, I couldn't agree more with Brandon that these tests are remarkably effective. I also am a fan of following up really well on references. I know that sounds really simple, and I know full well how people can stack their references. But the fact of the matter is that so many times I hear about some horrifying hiring and not even in this business, but elsewhere, I find out that no one ever called the references. No one ever did the due diligence. And
Yeah.
and if you've ever been one of those people who calls for references, which I've done, you can learn a tremendous amount just by reading between the lines of every phone call you make. If someone gives you a couple references and no one will return your calls, you can't track anyone down, and two of the references share a last name or with the applicant or whatever, you can really start to get a sense of things. I don't have any problems. I mean, if you're hiring a physician, you should call the person who managed the last place that physician worked and maybe the one before it. I don't have to list all of the red flags that common sense would indicate for you on someone's resume. Pick up the phone and make the calls. Most managers are reluctant to do it because it's work and you're making effectively a cold call. But just like Brandon said, if it's $200 to run one of these tests and you learn one thing that either gets someone on your staff or keeps them off, the same is true as following up references. If it takes you an hour, 2 hours, and you end up avoiding someone who could have brought your practice down, it seems like money well spent, if you ask me.
Yeah. References, I have a love and hate relationship. Again, I have a love and hate relationship with a lot of things, apparently. I'm finding out as we do this podcast. References, I'm just not sold on references.
They're not, but they're not. I agree with you. They're too flawed, but you can find things out at the extremes.
It's almost like finding a needle in a haystack, I guess. Sometimes I'm not sure if it's worth it. Joanna, by the way, is all for the references. She's on your boat. I'm like, and here's the reason why I don't like references. One, you just mentioned all the flaws and everything, so those are obvious. But the thing is that I don't know what to do with the reference if the reference is a bad, like if I read between the lines. Because one, reading between the lines is subjective.
Yep.
Two, okay, let's say they're a great candidate, they did very well, and then all of a sudden this reference comes back and there's some potential red flags. What do I do with this information? So if it's good, well, it's good, okay. And if it's bad, then the bad is going to show up elsewhere. And I don't know if the reference is going to necessarily one way or the other.
Let's say you're that desperate practice, which is what you were once, and Dr. Skinner is somewhat, and you're facing a candidate who looks great, but has a reference that makes you question. All right, you're still convinced. You're still saying to yourself, "I got to take this doctor." All right, I don't have a choice. This person's good enough. I feel my gut feeling is good. There's just this bad reference. Well, at least the reference gives you something to look for. Like if what you hear from the reference is that this person didn't have great clinical skill here or was really bad about that, well, you're just prepared for it, and you might be able to do something about it. I just also often question it's really funny. I question when people give you references and then you get a less than stellar response. I mean, what does that tell you when the second person on someone's reference list says, yeah, no, I wouldn't hire her again? I was just I was talking to a billing service the other day who is actually facing the same dilemma. They need to expand and they want to add some staff. And they had found previously some people they thought were real all-stars, but they hadn't hired them yet, and I asked the person who runs the billing service, I said, well, can you call any of those all-stars back? And he said, it's really funny. Every single one of them said no, just sort of ended the conversation in a very weird way. Like this one just stopped responding to email. And this other one agreed to meet for lunch and then never showed up. And he said they went from being great candidates to being bad candidates instantly simply because they weren't being professional. And so I'm a fan of gathering evidence. I realize the evidence is imperfect, and in the end, you are going to have to make a tough decision.
Yeah. I mean, there's no easy answer, and I'm not saying it's bad to go out for the references. I'm just saying, and I think doctors, and I don't know if you see, but Joanna always explains to me, and being around her such a long time and seeing her treat patients, she'll explain to me that some, people will order tests, lab work, but she explains to me that they don't. These are usually younger doctors. They don't necessarily think about what the result of the test is going to get them. Okay, so if I get a negative on this result, what am I supposed to do with it now? It's like, what do I do? Now I'm obligated to do other things. So it's like, is it worth doing the test? Will the result actually dictate how I'm going to, decide whether or not I'm going to go? So that's kind of how I put the reference. Sometimes it might make sense, and sometimes what are you going to do with that response or that result?
Right. But 9 times out of 10, when you get the bad person, you go back and you look and you're like, boy, I wish I'd come.
And I was just about to say that. I remember one time I did the reference, and it was kind of like I read between the lines, but I was just like, man, it's not clear. And she said this, she said that, and then about a week later, this was with a nurse. She only lasted like 2 days with us, and then I'm like, I know exactly what that other person was telling me in that reference. Now it became crystal clear.
All right, so what I want to do is I want to ask a question about recruiting, but before I do that, I want to add one thing to something you said. So you had made the point earlier that as a small practice, you feel like you need some leverage. And let me talk very briefly. I know that's hard to believe, but I'll do my best. Let me talk very briefly about a piece of leverage that I think as a solo, or not a solo practice, but as a small practice, you often overlook. And I think this tool, this leverage point is going to become more and more important over the next 2 or 3 years.
All right, I'm all ears because I'm interested in hearing this.
So the thing that you have to offer that someone who wants to go, who's thinking about working in the hospital, can never offer. No, I got my language wrong. That the hospital can never offer to someone who's looking to work there is that you offer independence. And I'm saying this for 2 reasons. I'm going to describe how and you can offer that and why that's important in a minute. But what I want to make clear is if you are not offering some kind of independence, then you are sunk. If you're saying, because if you do not allow someone to have a lifestyle that matches yours, if you don't have values that are different from the hospital's, then you are absolutely right, you will get sunk because the hospital will write a bigger check than you. If the only difference between working for you and working for the hospital is the paycheck and less call, all right, then why would someone come work for you?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So what I tell people is, look, you may work harder. You may have Friday evenings that you regret working in this independent practice. You may feel nervous about payroll. We can go through the list of the trials and tribulations of owning a small practice, but you will get to practice medicine the way that you want to. You will practice medicine with peers and partners who are in line with what your standard of excellence is, and not some third party who doesn't even care about you. That's what happens when peds work at hospitals. You have the ability to set your own course in a way that you could never do that as an employee in a large organization. I worked with a practice out in California last year who they have a very nice. These are 2 older docs, one of whom is about to retire. The other one will be retiring in a couple of years, and they wanted to add someone in, and add someone in to sort of take over ultimately. And they weren't even looking to sell the practice. They weren't looking to cash out. They just wanted to maintain some clinical continuity for their patients. And they also know that they've got this insane setup where they own the building, they have a huge patient volume, they're making good money. They live in this beautiful part of Northern California. It's like a dream. And they didn't want to just shut the door on the dream. They wanted to hand the keys to someone else. And ultimately, they found someone, but they realized they had to tell the story. And it'll be interesting to see if this practice is listening to the podcast. They'll write me and say, hey, that was us. But they had to tell the story about how they weren't simply a paycheck. They know that these young doctors are coming out of medical school with these huge, bills, these huge debts, and they said, look, it might take you 2 or 3 years longer to pay off that debt, but you are going to know your families, you're going to enjoy practicing medicine, and in many ways, your employment is going to be more secure than if you were employed by the hospital, because being employed by the hospital is not a ticket to safety and security by any means. And so I want you, Brandon.
Well, I have a few other things that I want to get in because I think that they're very important before we transition to something else. I'm going to try to be brief.
Go.
So flexibility is what I sold. So you're talking about how did you reference to it? What did you just say right now? I went blank. I was writing and I forgot.
No. I was talking about your independence.
Oh, independence. Okay, so I sold it as flexibility.
Yep, absolutely.
We sold it as, you have an opportunity here to grow. You have an opportunity to run with projects that you want to do. So if you think that it's, if you are passionate about asthma kids, and you want to run with an asthma clinic, hey, we'll love it. If you are passionate about, serving the underserved, or if you want to do a clinic for underserved areas, hey, we'll find a way to do it. So we're open to that sort of thing. So flexibility was one thing that I saw. Going back to the hiring, to the DISC assessment, to the character traits, I want to mention one thing about people's strengths. This is something that I just became apparent to me like two days ago on this book that I'm reading. But I've heard it a few times. And when you were talking about the marriage, about finding somebody in the marriage, I think this is very important. Whatever that person's strength is also their biggest weakness. All right. So here's how that works. If you have somebody that's a leader, for example, that has a great leadership type of strength, sometimes that leader is also very good at using other people, right? And that's their weakness. They use their leadership to do it. When you're getting married, like the woman might say, oh, he's so focused on his job. He's career focused. It's great because, he has a great job and he makes a lot of money. Well, guess what? That means that guy's a workaholic. So his fantastic trait that you think that he's great, he's a great engineer, he's a great astronaut. I don't know what the heck, you say. The fact that he or she has reached that level of, what would you call it, of success in that area, that demonstrates a certain quality in that person, is also the quality that's going to drive you crazy after a few years of being with them. All right. So we have characters in our office that they're perfectionists, right? They don't settle for less, and of course that is a great asset.
That's not you though, perfectionist.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
I'm like you. I'm like you there.
So, but that is the very thing that often drives us crazy about that person, that nothing is ever good enough for them, right? So for me, I'll be candor about me. My strength is very peacemaker, although I was thinking about this in our last discussion. It has nothing to do, but in situations, I actually hate conflict. I don't know, it's funny, but in real life, conflict is highly uncomfortable, and I'm a peacemaker. That's one of my greatest, that's one of my strengths. I can look at people, and I'm like a great mediator, a great negotiator. That's where my strengths come in. The problem is that sometimes I'm a pushover too. I let people, in the best interest of keeping everybody happy, I might not take a stand on certain situations and not continue pursuing. So and that drives some people that are very close to me. That drives them crazy. They're like, why don't you stand? Why don't you? Here you are arguing against me. Like I only argue with the people that I like you, like my wife, like other. But when I have to argue with somebody else, I'm like, well, that seems like a reasonable thing, I'm this, Mr. Submissive guy. So, anyways, my strength is also my weakness, and that's very important. That's something that I just learned very recently, and I'm trying to apply it. The other thing that I want to talk about is that we committed the error of not interviewing the candidates enough. And because our desperateness of trying to get somebody in there, and this not only happened with doctors, but it's also happened repeatedly with the staff. And we are just this spring, we were in desperate need for warm bodies in the office. We were, as a matter of fact, the fact that we weren't properly staffed was having an impact on our ability to offer this exceptional customer service that I'm always striving for. So it was actually impeding our very own values, not having the right people. But because we've made so many mistakes, we had to exercise extreme discipline to not go out and hire somebody that came out if they weren't absolutely the right candidate. And it drove the candidates crazy because here, get this, Chip, we brought people back like 5 times.
That's awesome.
In addition to the DISC assessment.
If you're interested. If they blow you off after the second or third.
Exactly. So it shows, not only it shows our discipline, our patience, but it also shows if that person really wanted. And one of the candidates said, hey, Brandon, I got offered a few jobs, but I felt that this was the place, and she waited for us. And she took the risk. What was that?
What does that tell you?
I know, it tells me a lot. And she's worked out so well so far. So for Dr. Katrina, though, Skinner, Dr. Katrina Skinner, she, my guess is that she doesn't have, a large staff. So how does she apply this interview multiple times? I think that she should either, if she's married or if she has close friends or parents, I would almost suggest to have them also interview the person, and perhaps it not be, a structured interview, but more like a social interview, and to ask that relative that knows him, knows her very well, do you see me working with this person, for the next 5, the next 10 years? And I bet you that they'll be able to give her some insights that will be tremendously valuable. So, and if the candidate doesn't like that, then fine. That's absolutely fine. But the more interviews you can have with a candidate, and don't apologize for the amount of time that you spent in the interviewing process. It's going to be well worth it. And if you can do no less, I've known companies that bring in companies outside of medical practices that bring in candidates a bunch of times, like excessive, 10 times interview, especially for if the positions are very important, which this is.
Well, if you look at musicals, okay, Broadway musicals, the musicals in Chicago and LA and stuff like that, and when they are auditioning people for parts, you can be brought back 24 times, and the reason that's important is because you're talking about chemistry, and the chemistry in your practice is vital. It's about trusting each other. And so, Brandon, I could not agree more. I also am a fan of, I like very often what I call informal interviews, or no, I don't call them that. I just think of them that way. Where you don't necessarily have a list of questions, but you go get some lunch. Dinner sometimes make it sound more formal, but you go grab some lunch. You meet somewhere outside of the office, seeing how people behave in public, seeing how people treat wait staff, seeing all those little things add up. And although yes, you can still end up with a sociopath who looks great for the first time. The fact is most people will filter out pretty quickly. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on.
Yep. The topic I want to talk about now is I'm going to jump ahead, and I'm going to say, let's say you've identified the world's best recruit. And you want to make this happen. So what is the actually? What I'll do is I'll read Dr. Skinner's questions. I've got them right here. So she asks, okay, how do I structure a new MD package? Salary versus production. Salary for a while and then production. At what point and at how much? What benefits? How specific do I outline work hours, call duties, etc.? And what happens if I can't stand the person I hire after 3 months? So Brandon, what I want to hear about first is what you did, what you do now, and then I'll add my 2 cents.
Okay.
So how do you how did you originally set up the contract with employees?
I was thinking of if we perhaps jump too far ahead, and I don't know if you did this purposely, but when do you know, because you have all the things that we talked about, but when do you know it's time to bring in somebody new?
Yeah, well, I'm going to talk about that.
Address that one first, or we should go on with the package?
Let's go with the package, and then we'll talk about the last part new, especially because I want to make sure that Dr. Skinner listens to the whole thing.
Okay.
So she's got to get all the way to the end.
All right. So so the question is the package. So what we did was base salary. We started out with a base salary because and this has to do because we were dealing more. We got a little guy here. I got my assistant. For those of you that are watching the video, I'm working from home today.
Wait,
so
it looks like he's pulling some strings behind you.
I know. Anyway, so I think that it's so the reason why we went with a very simplified package, compensation package, is because we happen to have more resident, people coming out of residency as candidates, and they get really, unless they, I don't know, I haven't come across anybody that feels very comfortable with this production package. If you have somebody that's a veteran, perhaps they'll be all over it because they know what they can produce, they know how the system is. But in my experience, we offer, we offer a base salary. We don't really talk about incentives or anything like that the first year or production. And we try to, we offer healthcare benefits for the physician. They can add their family, but that's on their, that they have to pay for that. We offer a 401k plan, and then depending on the need in our practice, at the beginning we were very open towards a lot of time off. We felt that that was one of the things that we were able to offer that other people weren't, is to be generous with our time off, because we perhaps thought that, if our salary wasn't as good as what we could, that some other people could offer. So that's basically what we went. And then depending on how that doctor does, then we decided, to put them on in an incentive package. But I haven't gotten down so far where we've done a situation where it's 100% production. There's always a base layer of a basic what do you call it, a base salary. And then we add incentives as we go. And you can get, I think I talked about this before, but we've gotten, creative. We talked about physician compensation packages.
Yep.
That is an important topic. So I won't get into that because I already spent time talking about the different compensation packages, but there's a lot of creative things that you can do. But we keep it, to answer the question, we keep it simple, base salary. I find out basically what the base salary is in the area. I also identify what we can pay, what is a reasonable amount. There's a lot of cost numbers that I go into. I kind of picture what would be the worst case scenario if we had to bankroll the entire amount for that year, assuming that doctor does not bring a single soul into the practice, and what that would look like, and how comfortable we would be. Is it 120? Is it 200? Is it only 100? I don't know. And then based on that, then I come up with the salary.
Okay. Yeah. And all right. My addition there would be, well, first of all, Dr. Skinner, you should definitely go back and look at the physician compensation piece that we did, I think, 2 episodes ago, because we cover a lot of this in detail. For a physician walking into a practice, the one danger of using productivity out of the gate is that if that physician doesn't have the opportunity to be full. So if you're a solo and you're just really busy, and you add a physician and you can really only get them to half or 2/3 productivity for that first year because you haven't put the pieces into place to fill in the schedule, then you really stand the chance of upsetting a doctor. All right, you don't want to tell them, oh, you could make 300 grand this year if you see enough patients, if the patients aren't there. So as long as you can allow for that, I'm very much in favor of having some measure of productivity for any physician whatsoever. I don't care what it is, and again, I refer you to our piece on that to talk about it.
But I think it's a pretty safe bet, at least in my experience, that you can probably do a base salary at the beginning, and if you can decide whether or not to throw in some incentives, but the first year, a base salary, and you should probably talk about a production incentive package. Anything after the year, so it could be 2 years, 2 years and a half. It might be, okay. Would you agree with that, Chip?
I totally agree with that. And I think now we do have to make some allowance for the fact that everyone is hiring regionally. So if in your town, for some reason, you're the only crazy person offering a package like this, you might have to amend it. But by and large, nationally, what you and I just outlined is really pretty normal, and it should appeal, frankly, to most people who want to work in private practice. Well, if you have zero ambition, if you don't care how many patients you see, if you just want to be there from 9 to 5 and go home, you're already probably working for a hospital anyway, or that's where you should be going to. So part of, keep in mind that your offer is also part of your practice DNA. And it's perfectly reasonable to say, we expect you to share in the reward of hard work.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
She also talks about here about benefits, that we address that, and how do you outline work hours, call duties, etc. And I think that goes back to what you mentioned in determining what is it that you want. So if you want somebody to share the entire workload, then the expectation is that you're going to be working full time. I want somebody to, for us it was clear. It's like, no, we want you to work as many hours as we're working, so it's equal time, and you're going to be on call just as long, much as you're going to be rounding just as much. So now that instead of one doctor, now there's two, so it's everything is 1 and 2, or so it's 40 or 50 hours a week, whatever whatever you work is. So, but if you only want that person to come in the afternoons, or you only want somebody to work Saturdays for you, which is going to be very difficult. But let's go say that's the only thing that you want, then you structure the compensation package only for the person to work in the afternoon and on Saturdays, for example.
Yeah, start with a very specific outline of what your ideal candidate would do. And you can say, ideally, I want someone to work these hours and see this many patients and do this amount of call, and then explain which parts are hardwired, like you must see, you can't go below this number, or you have to split call me. I'm not going to hire someone. I'm not going to double my doctors and still be the only person covering call. I mean, I just ran into this the other day yesterday with a practice that has a physician who refuses to take call and refuses to do weekends. So she's been stuck as an employee, and you don't want the same surprise. So say, this is my ideal, but these are the things that are really important to me, and I can't adjust. And you have that conversation up front. It reduces the chances of you waking up 6 months into this saying, I've just made a huge mistake. That's my Arrested Development quote. So now, Dr. Skinner then evolved into this question: what happens if I can't stand the person I hire after 3 months? This is a key question, and in some ways, if I had to pick 2 or 3 things that if I could resolve for all practices, this might be on the list. And my only advice there is that this is somewhat regionalized. All right, you may or may not be able to get away with a temporary contract. The first thing I would tell you is, if you define malpractice or negligence in your contract properly, it will allow you to get out of the most egregious and scary circumstances pretty well. Not always, but if someone comes in and you discover that they are a threat to your patients, or that they're performing malpractice, or they're doing something dangerous, you want to be able to get rid of that person overnight without recourse and without having to go back and fight it. So that's partially contractual. But the other stickier one, the one that is harder to resolve, is what happens if you're at basically singledoctors.com and you go on a couple internet dates and everything looks good, and you get in there and you find out that, wow, you're really not compatible. Well, you can do what many practices I know do, and then just ignore it and have 20 years pass and practice in some mild misery. Or you can actually build something into your agreement that indicates that if this is not working out for either party, because the other person might, is going to have the same fear as well, you might have a testing period. You might have a prohibitionary period, like for 6 months or a year. I don't think you can go much farther than that. I mean, it might really only be 6 months, and say, look, for the first 6 months, at the end of 6 months, we're going to check in, and then there can be a total walk away.
Yeah.
The tricky part as the recruiting physician is that how do you get someone to move to your town for 6 months? If you're forced to make someone to move there, you might be forced by your local market to do something more, to be more responsible for a person you might not like. Other practices, like Brandon, you're in Chicago. You might not. This might not be a problem. But for someone like Dr. Skinner, it may be.
Yeah.
I don't have a great answer to that. And
in our contract, we tried very hard to outline some of the things that we would consider to be deal breakers, and this is beyond malpractice or things like that. That's a given that you're not going to continue with somebody that puts your practice in jeopardy. But we have things even for insubordination, for example. If we see consistently insubordination, then that would be a cause, for the contract to break. And there's also, we also actually put it in there, which this is when you love attorneys. This is a few times where you love attorneys, where that we can dissolve this contract for any, for any reason, or for not even any reason at all. It even says there specifically. Of course, it's not like we can close the door on somebody. We got to give them some time to transition out and things like that. And so, but we at least, have put those things in there, so you can address those things in contracts. And of course, drafting something like that, you'd want a real astute attorney to help you out with that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, you know what? Neither of us said at the beginning of this, Dr. Skinner. If you're about to go hire a new physician or nurse practitioner, the front of your list needs to be go get a good attorney.
Yeah.
That should go without saying, but unfortunately, all too often it does go without being said.
Well, the thing is that most doctors, at least the ones that I've dealt with, I shouldn't say most, the ones that I've dealt with have all had decent attorneys. Michigan Avenue attorneys, which is here in Chicago, are that would be, I don't know, whatever the equivalent in New York. What is the fancy street? I don't know, Manhattan attorney or something like that. But
Park Avenue attorney.
Yeah, Park Avenue attorney. So, and they could be very crafty and look at they're going to they're spending $500-600 an hour on that attorney, who maybe even more. So it's worth your while to also have a good one that also can defend that sort of thing and go back and forth with them.
Yeah, and one thing to keep it in the back of your mind, which is it contradicts a little bit of what we've had to say, is Dr. Skinner is not the only small private physician's practice in the U.S. struggling to hire a new employee right now, or a new physician. It's happening everywhere all the time. And so if you do have an attorney, this is not a contract that should be drawn up from scratch. This is a wheel that's been invented 1,000 times. And somewhere in the United States right now, some pediatrician is signing an agreement to be employed or to becoming a partner. And just use some common sense, and I think you'll be okay. So now let's get to the topic that we mentioned earlier, which I think is very interesting, and that is, how do you tell when you need to hire somebody?
When you're ready.
What's that? When you're, well, you don't want to hire out of desperation, and you don't want to hire in advance of, or I should say, on spec, like I think we're going to get these patients. You want to find that sweet spot in between where I want to hire a doctor the moment I have room for their capacity. How do you determine that? And I'll tell you in a moment how I do it. But Brandon, when did you figure out that you wanted to hire a doctor?
This was such a difficult question or answer to put to this question. We thought about it for such a long time, and I didn't really know. And the reason why I didn't know, it was because it's not like we were turning away, a whole bunch of patients. That would have been easy. That probably be the easiest way to know when you're ready. So if you normally see 25 patients and you are turning away 25 patients, in other words, 50 patients were trying to see you that day, then that's easy. Go hire somebody else and you're ready, right? But it never got to that point. It never got to that point. I mean, we were busy, but it never got to the point where we were having to turn people away. Here's the thing that we decided on. We didn't necessarily hire somebody when we first decided to hire our first doctor because of any other reason, but for really lifestyle. That was really the reason why we first looked for somebody. So my goal for that provider was simply for that provider to pay for themselves. I wasn't even looking for adding revenue to the practice or growing for the sake of growing. I just simply wanted to, I wanted to ease the burden on, my pediatrician Joanna's lifestyle. So that was a simple choice. Made it simpler to make that choice because it was like, okay, we don't want to be on call because when I say we were also on call. The family was on call too, right? Because many times we had to put the kids, in their pajamas, get in the car, and go to the hospital so she wouldn't have to go by herself because there was a newborn, and then the next day she wasn't going to have time to see it, and then by the time she was going to get there, it was beyond the 24 hours. So let's go tonight. And we get it
Brandon, be honest though. Have you ever pretended to be your wife on the phone?
No, never. I've never done that. Although people call me doctor all the time, they're like Dr. Betancourt. In fact, just 2 days ago, I called the AP line to make reservations for NCE, and for housing and the housing AP. And they're like, well, thank you, doctor. This doctor, because Dr. Betancourt, there happens to be a Dr. Betancourt for real. And I'm Betancourt, and I always struggle with when to say, I'm not a doctor or not, because it's just like 2 minutes or 30 seconds, and I'm like, is it worth saying I'm not a doctor? It's not like they're asking for advice, Like, hey, my kid has a fever. What do you think I should do, doctor? It's never been like that before.
Right.
So, anyways, so I didn't know I was ready in terms of money, because we were looking for lifestyle. And when we hired the doctor, it wasn't like, we were probably in our second, maybe third year of practice, and we were still paying loans, and we were, the money the revenue that we were having, which wasn't a whole lot, got put back into the practice, or even increasing our salary, which was like, barely making it when we first started. So it was just increasing our lifestyle, but not because we wanted to be rich, just like bring it to where we needed, to have it. So what I did was very simple math, and we've talked about this. It's the same math that we've talked about. So let's say that I'm not interested in revenue. All I want is improve my lifestyle. So I add up the cost of bringing in that doctor. So let's go say, just for make it real simple, it's $100,000. I know that that's not a good number, but let's just say it's $100,000. And then we say, okay, I'm going to offer them benefits, and that's going to be another $6,000 a year. And then malpractice, I don't know, let's say another, $5,000. So that's 11, 100, what is it? Let's just say $120,000. That's what it comes out to be.
Okay.
Right? Now, the expenses, you can decide whether or not you're going to hire a medical assistant or not, or keep the same staff. We didn't. So for us, and we didn't have to increase, buy more space, more equipment, more nothing. So I was able to just focus on my 120 number that I'm making up. I also know what my average revenue was for the practice, which is a key number that we've talked plenty about how important it is to know. But what I did to be even better, to be more conservative, not better, is that I said, let's assume for 1 second that this doctor is going to only see our worst paying patients, all right, which is Medicaid. And I did the average on Medicaid because I knew that I could fill up her schedule with Medicaid. Not so much with Blue Cross Blue Shield, but I knew for sure that Medicaid, there was a demand for it. So I said, if this doctor only sees Medicaid, and the average Medicaid reimbursement is XYZ, then I divide that number by 120, and then I knew how many patients that person needed to see in order for us to improve our lifestyle. And I left it at that. I didn't care about anything else, and I knew that anything else beyond that would have been icing on the cake. Certainly, the plan wasn't to stick with only Medicaid, but it was the easiest way that I thought that I could bring somebody in with minimizing the risk of not getting in trouble with getting not having enough money. And in order to secure that that money, and I've since revised my thought on loans and credit and things like that, but that's probably another great discussion on how much credit you should have. But I just secured a line of credit specifically for that doctor, for those expenses, just in case, even if not a single Medicaid patient showed up, I could still be able to keep that doctor. And I didn't have a $120,000 line of credit. I mean, it was maybe like a 30 or 50 at most line of credit. But I figured that with the little money that was already coming in, plus the 40 or I think $50,000 line of credit that I had at the time, I would be able to stretch it for about a year and a half. And surely I knew that by then, she was going to be able to have enough patients to fill up her schedule.
Right. And, Brandon, the process that you just defined is so much better than what I see in a lot of places. I know a lot of practices who go and hire someone. They give them a big, fat, guaranteed salary. They don't actually stop to think about the impact of an additional provider on space. Oh, well, we only have 4 exam rooms, and now sometimes we're both booked at the same time. Silly stuff like that happens a lot more than people think. Or, if we really want to maximize this person, we're going to have to add some exam rooms, adding staff, adding support staff. Going from 1 to 2 doctors, if you're literally doubling the patient volume, means if you're not adding staff, that means you are either overstaffed before or you will be understaffed going forward. I think your point about having a little bit of either some cash in the bank or having a line of credit is really important. Very often these days, it seems to be happening with more regularity. I'm running into practices where the new doctor doesn't get credentialed properly. This happens over and over again, and suddenly your payments for this doctor are delayed by 4 or 8 or 12 weeks. And I've seen some examples, I'm not exaggerating, where it's
credentialing sometimes it takes, I mean, I don't understand why, but 6, 7 months to credential a doctor in
oh, yeah. This is true in certain states and certain places where A, if your staff doesn't do it quite right, and B, you get misled by a payer. Suddenly you wake up and you have 6 months where you're not getting paid properly, and if you haven't gotten that line of credit, I mean, Brandon, as you pointed out, you're suddenly in big trouble. So I'm really glad you pointed that out. The only things I would add on to what you stated, because your outline was quite right, was that you should go to your system, whether it's your EHR, your practice management system. You can also make some judgment about your potential visit volume. Right now, even if you're tracking everyone you turn away, you're only hearing from the people who contact you. You might find that when you hire a new patient or hire a new doctor, that you actually have a few hundred patients who are overdue for their well visits or for their ADHD follow-up or their asthma or whatever, and you need to get right on it. I worked with a practice who last year opened up a new location and had no plans whatsoever for filling the slots at that location. They just sent 2 fully employed doctors out there to staff it, and they didn't do any recall. And is it any surprise that it's taken almost a year for that office to get up to speed, whereas if they had prepped it in advance and done some recall and said, hey, you're overdue on some well visits, even if 90% of the people they got in touch with didn't respond with a visit, those 10% that's the difference between keeping your doors open and not. So use your system to get an estimate of your potential visit volume and what you could do to backfill it. And last but not least on this topic, here's a really, I think so far, my experience is, here's a really simple rule of thumb. I mean, you do what Brandon did, which is to calculate literally to figure out how many visits am I going to need to break even. But here's a fast one. If you want to pay your doctor $100,000, just because it's an easy number to do math on, if you want to make sure that you're not going to regret it, that doctor needs to earn at least $300,000 or $400,000. All right? You need to pay your providers 25 to 33% of what they bring in for revenue in order to stay ahead of the game. And the math for that is very, very simple. If your overhead minus their salary is 60 to 65%, which is pretty normal, that leaves 35%, 35 to 40% left over. But let's say it's 35%, okay? If that's your overhead, 65%, you've got 35% left over. There's your 33 that I was talking about. Yeah. And to get to 25, well, guess what? 33 to 25 or 25 to 35, there's a 5 to 10% margin. That's not only your margin of error in case you get anything wrong, but it's also your margin for profit. So if this is an employed physician, to profit 5% on their work is hardly greedy, and that's the benefit you get from taking the risk as the owner. So if you want to pay them $100,000, they've got to bring in $350,000 to $400,000 in my book.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and again, just to make it simple, obviously you want to, have that person bring back money for you, but I think that when you're starting in your solo practice, oftentimes what we're looking for is simply a lifestyle. So if you don't want to worry about that, if you want to build that into your math, then great, just say, hey, listen, 120, and then you got to bring in this much, and then because I need to have, in addition to my lifestyle, I also want to make money off of you, which is an absolutely reasonable request as well. Why would you, bring it in, bring somebody else in? The only, I'm going to make a comment here about the recalls, and this is one of the things that I think that differs when you talk about theory and then practical and actually in the practice. what generally happens when you have a solo doc and you bring somebody in and you start doing this recall, it's already difficult enough to get people in just by mere recall. It's only a small percentage that actually eventually comes, right?
Well, I'm not going to accept that premise yet, but keep going.
Okay.
All right.
So it's like, well, we can talk about it. It's almost like direct mail. You send 10,000 because you only know that 1% or 2% are going to respond to your direct mail. That's the way I view recalls. But okay, I mean, you usually get a better response than direct mail. I'm not suggesting it's the same.
Yeah, we'll get back to it. No, you will not get 100% ever.
Okay, totally. And that's what I'm saying. You're not going to get 100% of those recalls. That's what I'm saying. Second of all, it's really hard when you're a solo doc and you've been in practice for 4 years, like Dr. Skinner, to get the patients to see somebody else. That is a difficult, and it's not something that you should underestimate. So that's the only thing that I would bring in. And I'm not saying that your suggestion to do the recalls is don't do it. I'm just saying that it's don't let it seem like it's that simple of a thing. Like, oh, just get all your recalls and all of a sudden that doctor is full. It requires a lot of work to convince somebody. It's like, you have a new doctor, but I don't know that doctor. No, heck, I want to go see Dr. Skinner. And then that is the whole reason why you're bringing in another doctor, is because everybody wants to see Dr. Skinner.
Right.
And that's why she's desperately trying to find somebody else. So it's a terrible situation to be in. We have it all the time.
Brandon, you're absolutely correct, and I think we need to do a podcast about patient recall, because I agree with everything you say. I will say that having benchmarked this a little bit, I like to see a 20 to 40% return on patient recall. All right, which is a lot.
I agree with that number. Yeah.
I
can say I haven't benchmarked it like you have, but just by being a numbers guy and looking at that stuff, I would say we're in that ballpark.
I have some tricks I can share with people later about how to make it effective. And you're absolutely right. A huge component to me of patient recall is also patient re-education. Your patients have been seeing Dr. Betancourt all this time, the other one, the real one, and they love her. They don't want to switch. Why would we switch? But the fact of the matter is, if you're ever going to grow, and you may not want to, but if you're ever going to get to 3 or 4 or 5 docs, your patients are going to have to get used to seeing someone else, unless each doctor is so focused on only his or her own panel, which can happen. I have practices who work like that, but you can't really fully judge if that's a possibility without knowing how big is my backlog. Now, Dr. Skinner, for example, she said in her note that she's got this huge newborn volume. So for her, it's actually going to be really easy to transition those.
Excellent. Yes, I forgot. I missed that. Yes.
Yeah, but what you're going to have to do, and basically all I'm advocating for here is do some math to help make some predictions. You won't be 100% accurate, but it'll help. You look at your newborns, you look at your potential volume, and you can actually say to your patients, look, Dr. Joanna is booked through August or September. We're delighted to have you wait for her, even though that's clinically not that great, but we're delighted to have you wait for her, or you can see so-and-so now. And if 10% of those families come out of your backlog for Dr. 1 and are used to populate Dr. 2, it just makes that transition that much smoother. I do work with practices, solos, who from time to time, because of the way their practice works, they don't have a backlog. They don't have a waiting list. They don't have this big number of patients who they could pass off to someone. Not that will, but they could. And you don't want to assume that the demand is there unless you go out and try to measure its potential.
Yeah.
If like you said, you're turning away as many patients as you see every day, you've got a different feeling about it. And
right.
So that's the point I want to get to. The worst thing is to hire a doctor.
Is that with that whole bringing in a new doctor is that don't be afraid of the patients that will leave, because all of a sudden they're not being able to see the doctor that they've always seen. Don't get discouraged by that, even though we do get discouraged by that. So I'm saying it for us as well, but we have patients that they get so upset when they don't see the doctor that they want to see that they actually leave the practice as a result. So hey, Hey, Chip. That whole,
Are
it
we
looks like
back?
we froze for, I didn't hear that last comment of yours. I don't know
Oh
if you
no,
got
you're done. Yeah, how are you?
good. All right.
Yeah. No, no, like I only heard up to when I agreed with you. I only heard up to when I agreed with you, and then you're back.
No, yeah, well, no, I didn't say anything. I just said that I didn't catch that last point. And what I don't know if you got, did you catch the point about some people leaving and just because they're upset? Did you get that?
Oh yeah, and then what must have happened is like you were on a little loop. It sounded for me on this end like you went on a 2-minute talk, and I was like, you know what, he's gonna have to do it again. So it sounds like no,
No,
you're
I
done.
didn't go on. I just said it real quick
I'll
that
cut that all
people
out.
are going to
So
leave in that,
do you have?
and then not to get discouraged by that, even though we still get discouraged when people, because like, I've been with you for 4 years and I've done everything for your child and you just can't see, somebody else because that person is helping me out and I can't see everybody,
Right.
All right, so I think we gave
No,
a
you
lot
can
of
say, look,
discussion here to Dr. Skinner. I hope that this was helpful for her. I don't know if we have anything else to add.
no, that's it. And I'd love to get her feedback and feedback from everyone else. We're going to do some recall work. We're going to talk about RVUs. Um, got Brandon and I. Well, at the end of our RVU talk, we'll have a vote. How's that? And I think this is a great topic, and I hope Dr. Skinner gives us some feedback. That's it.
All
Anything from
right.
you? All right.
Nothing for me. I
Thanks,
think we're
Brandon.
all done. Thank you for spending time with us. Chip and I are going to go back to sparring, and until next time.